আচ্ছা, আমি শুধু সব স্টুডেন্টদেরকে একটা রিকোয়েস্ট করছি, যাদের নাম নেই, একজনকে আমি দেখতে পাচ্ছি পার্টিসিপেন্ট লিস্টে গ্যালাক্সি J7 Prime 2, প্লিজ রিনেম ইয়োরসেলফ প্লিজ। গ্যালাক্সি J7 Prime 2।
আমি
ও আচ্ছা আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে,
গোলমাল হয়ে গেল তো।
ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে, ওকে ওকে ওকে।
স্টুডেন্টদের জন্য হলে তারা একটু নামটা ইউজ করবে, না
হ্যাঁ
হলে
হ্যাঁ, নামটা রিনেম করে তারা যেন নামটা ইউজ করে।
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, আমার আসলে সব গোলমাল হয়ে গেছে, আমি ল্যাপটপ থেকে সব অ্যাক্সেস পাচ্ছি না, আর ওটা রিমুভ হয়ে গেছে কোনো।
আর সব স্টুডেন্টদের জন্য বলার, তোমরা প্লিজ বি অ্যাটেন্টিভ এন্ড বি ডিসিপ্লিন, এবং প্রত্যেকে যা কিছু যদি তোমাদের কোনো কোয়ারি, যদি কোনো কমেন্ট যেগুলো থাকে, দেখো এখানে লেখা আছে, প্লিজ পুট দ্যাট অন দ্য চ্যাট বক্স।
হ্যাজ ডক্টর সায়ন চট্টোপাধ্যায় জয়েন্ট? হ্যাঁ,
ইয়েস,
ওকে, হ্যালো। A very
Yes,
good morning to
Roy,
all
I
of
have
you.
joined.
Yes, Shayan, have you joined? Okay, 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 okay.
I've just kept myself invisible, so whenever you want me to appear, I will do so.
Okay, Shayan, thank you. Okay, a very good morning to all of you. I welcome you all to this one-day national webinar on literature and culture, texts in contexts, organized by the Department of English, Bidhan Chandra College. Before the first keynote, I would like to play the speech of our Honorable Principal Sir, Dr. Falguni Mukhopadhyay.
Good morning, everybody. At first, I congratulate my colleagues of this college, governing body, Teachers Council, support staff, and colleagues of Department of English. The Department of English organized a national webinar on literature and culture, texts in contexts. It is very great pleasure for us and our institution to organize such type of webinar. We know that in this context, two eminent resource persons with us in this webinar, Professor Himadhi Lahiri, Professor, Department of English and Culture Studies, Bidhan University. I really thankful to Professor Lahiri for his presentation, for his engagement of this webinar, and I really thankful to him that in this context, in this crucial time, he spared his valuable time for this webinar. Secondly, Dr. Sayan Chattopadhyay, Assistant Professor, IIT Kanpur. Dr. Chattopadhyay spent his time for this webinar. On behalf of governing body and on behalf of my institution, I recognize his effort. I firmly believe this webinar must be benefited for the participant, researcher, teachers, scholar of this arena, mainly literature, subject English, and obviously the person who are interested in social sciences. I heartily welcome all, and again I congratulate my colleagues, especially the Department of English. I hope in our near future, after COVID-19, we organize various such type of seminar and webinar that will be benefited for our students, scholar, researcher, and other participant. Thank you all. Again, I welcome all participant, delegates, dignitaries, resource person, and students. Thank you. Thank you again.
Now I request our head of the department, Dr. Shubhadeep Ray, to introduce the speakers.
Very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you, Principal Sir. Thank you, Convener Ma'am. Good morning. This is a matter of great pleasure that we have amongst us two academicians of international repute, and they are our resource persons, Professor Himadhi Lahiri and Dr. Sayan Chattopadhyay. Our first speaker is Dr. Sayan Chattopadhyay, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, where he teaches English literature, critical theory, and communication studies. He received his doctorate degree in 2014 from the University of Cambridge and his master's degree from the University of Calcutta. His research has been primarily in the area of Indian middle class self-fashioning and its literary manifestations. His forthcoming book, Being English, Indian Middle Class and the Desire for Anglicization, explores three 20th century Indian writers, Cornelia Sorabji, Niroj C. Chaudhuri, and Don Morris, and their quest to fashion themselves as English. He was the 2017 Baden-Württemberg Research Fellow at the University of Heidelberg. Today, he will be speaking on Shal Trees Turning into Oaks, Lure and Anxiety of Anglicization in Colonial Bengal. So I humbly request Dr. Chattopadhyay to please deliver your speech, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. First of all, am I both audible and visible?
Yeah, both, sir.
Absolutely.
Absolutely okay.
All right. So thank you again, and also thank you, Troy, for inviting me here. Today I'm assuming that the audience that I will be primarily addressing is largely constituted of undergraduate students of English literature. Now, it becomes difficult to say what kind of audience you have sitting in front of a computer screen, but that is my assumption. So what I will try to do is I'll try to pitch my lecture primarily to them, which would mean that I would not be delving too much into theory. But I'm also told that there is going to be a question answer session. So if anyone wants me to unpack some of the theoretical complications that underpin my presentation, we can do so in that segment. So today what I would be exploring with you is a phenomenon which significantly defined the cultural response of the Indian middle class to British colonialism, and in a way complemented the nationalist response to British colonialism. And this is a phenomenon of Anglicization, or more simply put, the desire of a certain section of Indians to fashion themselves after the image of the British colonizer. Now, though I would be representing this phenomenon to be culturally almost as pervasive as the sentiments of nationalism, I should also tell you that this is one of the least explored phenomena within the Indian cultural history, especially within the field of literary studies. And the reason for this is not very hard to find. Firstly, any exploration of Indians who are desirous of transforming themselves into English appears to be disturbing from within the framework of dominant nationalist sentiments. And therefore, ever since independence, at least scholars who have worked on this area have found much more merit in either not talking about this phenomenon, not talking about the Indians who wanted to transform themselves into English, or by discussing them as irrelevant and even traitorous figures belonging to the fringe. Matters, in fact, have not improved with the rise of the academic industry of postcolonialism, where the stress on undoing Eurocentrism has meant that the phenomenon of Anglicization has been further pushed under the radar. Now, I don't know how many of you are plugged into this academic industry of postcolonialism as undergraduate students. If you are not, then don't bother about these complexities. However, as I would suggest, Anglicization has been too integral a part of our recent cultural history to be avoided, especially if you want to understand the complications of India's engagement with colonialism and its aftermath. Now, I'm going to divide today's lecture broadly into three sections. In the first section, I would discuss what I mean by Anglicization and why did a section of Indian population desire to Anglicize itself. In the second section, I discuss the complex set of anxieties that were generated because of this desire. And I would conclude the presentation today by looking at some of the ways in which the Indian middle class sought to overcome this conflict between desire and anxiety which surrounded the phenomenon of Anglicization. But before I start with this sequence, I would like to briefly talk about the limits that would frame today's discussion. So the first limit to our discussion that we need to keep in mind is that when we talk about Anglicization within the Indian context, at least as far as this lecture is concerned, we will primarily be talking about the desire of Anglicization within the Indian middle class. Now, what is the middle class? Well, in defining the middle class, I will primarily be taking my cue from historian Shumit Sarkar, who traces the emergence of this distinct social group to the spread of Western-style education, also known as English education, in colonial India during the 19th century. Writing about the socioeconomic roots of this new social group, Shumit Sarkar states, and I quote, "It searched for its model in the European middle class, which, as it learned through Western education, had brought about the great transformation from medieval to modern times through movements like the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and democratic revolution or reform. Yet its own social roots lay not in industry or trade, but in government service or the professions of law, education, journalism, or medicine, with which was very often combined some connection with land." Now, some of you who are familiar with the scholarship available on middle class would know that this is not the only definition of Indian middle class. This is actually the definition of what I would refer to as the colonial middle class, a middle class that came up during the colonial period in 19th century. And a very different kind of middle class has emerged in India following 1990s and the era of liberalism. So if you are aware of this scholarship, I would also like you to note that when we are going to refer to middle class, we are actually going to refer to this colonial middle class. Now, as this colonial middle class emerged in other parts of India, one could notice minor variations from the economic profile that Shumit Sarkar describes here, because Shumit Sarkar is primarily talking about the middle class as it originated in Bengal. But in spite of these differences, the three features that remained uniformly constant for the colonial middle class throughout India were, firstly, an exposure to English education, secondly, engagement in government services or professions, And thirdly, a desire to reform oneself by learning from the colonizer. So these are the three major aspects of this colonial middle class with which we will be dealing with. Now, since urban Bengal was the main seat of this new kind of Western education system that emerged during the colonial period, it was here that the Indian middle class first made its appearance. And this brings us to the second limit that would frame our discussion today, which is that when we talk about the Anglicization of the Indian middle class, we will talk primarily about the middle class that emerged in Bengal. So it will be a talk primarily on the Bengali middle class. However, we need to remember here that the Anglicization was a phenomenon that was not limited to Bengal. In fact, it stretched across the whole of colonial India. But discussing the entire Indian context will be too ambitious for our talk today. Therefore, we will limit ourselves to the context of colonial Bengal. So now that we have set ourselves these limits, let us move on to the first of the three sections that we'll be discussing, namely, what is Anglicization and why did the colonial middle class want to Anglicize itself at all? Well, the first question, what is Anglicization, can actually be answered at two different levels within the context of colonial Bengal. At one level, Anglicization meant acquiring the physical markers that differentiated the British colonizers from the Indian population. Historian Topon Raichaudhuri notes that the most obvious of these differentiating markers were firstly the white skin. And this is interesting, and we'll have to come back to this issue of whiteness and white skin later on. But also the trappings of his Christian faith and the peculiarities of his clothing, which was distinguished by the practice of wearing hats. So apparently hats were the most prominent things that distinguished the attire of a colonial gentleman. Now, if you want to imagine an instance of such an Anglicization at this most physical level from within the history of colonial Bengal, the best thing for you to do would be to imagine the figure of Michael Madhusudan Dotto, who not only converted to Christianity to become English, but also carefully fashioned his clothing and indeed his hairstyle. I'm not joking here. He fashioned his hairstyle after the colonizers. So his friend Budoy Mukhopadhyay writes that Madhusudan Dotto was very conscious about what kind of hairstyle he would have, and he would keep consulting whatever is the contemporary hairstyle in England, etc. But then Michael Madhusudan Dotto was not an isolated figure. Indeed, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, writing in the later part of the 19th century, notes how effects of Anglicization was all pervasive on the outer manifestations of the socio-cultural lives of most middle-class Bengalis. And I quote from an English essay by Bankim, where he writes that in outward circumstances of social and personal life, English-educated Bengalis are rapidly getting Anglicized. Few English-educated Bengalis will deny this. The stamp of the Anglo-Saxon foreigner is upon our houses, our furniture, our carriages, our food, our drink, our dress, our very familiar letters and conversations. He who runs may read it on every inch of our outward life. However, the effect of Anglicization within the Bengali middle class ran far deeper than these outward signs. Indeed, their desire to culturally emulate the colonizer almost as greatly transformed their inner lives and led to a large-scale adaptation of a worldview which bore the stamp of being Western. And describing this Western worldview, psychologist Ashish Nandi states that it was characterized by a belief, and I quote, in the absolute superiority of the human over the non-human and the subhuman, the masculine over the feminine, the adult over the child, the historical over the ahistorical, and the modern or the progressive over the traditional or the savage. So these were the two aspects that constituted Anglicization within colonial Bengal. One was the physical aspect, the other was this adaptation of this particular worldview, which was stamped as Western. But then the question arises, why did the colonial middle class Bengalis want to anglicize themselves at all? Now, if I was writing a journal paper on this, I would answer this question by referring to things like Robert Merton's reference group theory and the ways in which this theory has been modified within the Indian context by sociologists like M.N. Srinivas and Yogendra Singh, who have tried to adapt this to explain the phenomenon of modernization and the sub-phenomenon of westernization within it. But as I mentioned earlier, I would not be referring to theory much today, so let me try and answer this question to you differently. Now, imagine yourself as a 19th century middle class Bengali. You are situated within a colonial context, irrespective of how educated you are, from what kind of family you come from, how wealthy you are. Class made a difference, I mean, wealth made a difference, but irrespective of those differences, you would be situated within a colonial context where you clearly did not belong to the elite ruling population. In fact, the difference between you and those who rule over you are deeply entrenched within this colonial context, and they are constantly emphasized in every aspect of your quotidian life. For instance, a lot of government posts are unavailable to you. You are barred from taking those posts. A lot of public spaces within your city is beyond your access. And indeed, whole sections of public transport are beyond your access. You are barred from those areas. Now, in other words, therefore, discrimination against you is both organized and is seen as part of the norm. So discrimination is normal, discrimination directed against you. Now, the first thing probably that would hit you in such a context, living within such a context, is why are we colonized? Why are we in such a state of inferiority? And of course, the second question that would plague you, which emerges from the first question, is how can we emerge out of this situation of inferiority and earn a place within the elite circles of the colonizing population, right? Now, for many Bengalis, during the colonial period, the answer to the first question, that is, why are we colonized at all, was that the English who ruled over us did so or could rule over us because they have acquired cultural and technological superiority during the recent phase of history. So the belief in English superiority within the context of 19th century Bengal was pretty deep-rooted. And the answer to the second question, that is, how do we emerge out of this situation of inferiority, was that we can come out of the situation of inferiority and become as superior as a colonizing Sahib by learning from them and by adopting their ways. In other words, we can become superior like the colonial rulers by becoming more and more like them. This is precisely what Merton's reference group theory is all about. Now, the fact that such patterns of thinking and the resultant support for Anglicization were mainstream in colonial Bengal becomes amply evident from the works of someone like Bankim Chandra College, who is a major figure, major intellectual of this period. So, for instance, those of you who are familiar with his novel Anandamot will know how Bankim uses a semi-divine character near the end of his novel to make this following argument. And here I'm quoting from Julius Lipner's translation of the novel. Unless the English rule, it will not be possible for the eternal code. Now, eternal code is how Julius Lipner translates Sanatan Dharma. Bankim doesn't use the word Hindu Dharma, right? Sanatan Dharma. Unless the English rule, it will not be possible for the eternal code to be reinstated. The English are very good in the outward knowledge, and they are very good at instructing people. Therefore, we will make the English king. Right. Now, this is a rather problematic passage that we find in Bankim, and various people have tried interpreting it in various different ways and even denying it. But Bankim, in fact, makes this same argument again, and in his own voice, and even more powerfully in an essay titled Onukoron, where he writes, and I quote, and this is my translation: just as children learn to speak by imitating the speech of adults, to act by imitating the action of adults, so do uncivilized and uneducated people learn by imitating the ways of the civilized and the educated. Thus, it is reasonable and rational that Bengalis should imitate English. You'll have to remember that this is Bankim Chandra College, right? Now, such faith in colonial tutelage, however, opened up a glaring problem for the colonial middle class. And this brings us to the second section of our discussion today. The problem was that the idea of imitating the English colonizer generated amongst the Bengali middle class a significant degree of anxiety about losing their innate nature. And we see instances of this anxiety even in Bankim's own writings. For instance, take his humorous essay titled Prachina or Nobina, where he launches a scathing criticism of the attempt to educate and reform the traditional Bengali woman by educating her and turning her into a memsahib. And I quote, this is a translation by Doshodhara Bagchi. Educate the women, permit widows to get married again, emancipate them from their domestic cage, and let them fly up to the sky. Abolish polygamy and do whatever you can to make proper mem sahibs out of our Pachi and Rami and Madhi. If you can do it, well and good. But if Pachi grows into an English woman by and by, we may look forward to our shal trees turning into oaks one fine morning. Now, Bankim's comparison of turning Pachi into a Mem Sahib with the shal tree turning into oak trees suggests the impossibility of the attempt of reforming the lot of Bengali women, Bengali Hindu women. At one level, the argument here is that just as a shal tree cannot become an oak, so our Pachi cannot ever be turned into a Mem Sahib. But the problem here is that in this essay, Pachi, Rami, and Madhi represent the Prachinas or traditional Hindu women who are contrasted with Nobinas or the modern women. They were suggesting that a new breed of women has already emerged in colonial Bengal following attempts to educate and reform them. Thus, the comparison between Bengali women becoming Mem Sahibs and the shal trees becoming oaks also suggests an underlying anxiety. It speaks of the fear that such a transformation, in spite of its apparent impossibility, was actually taking place in the contemporary society. Shal trees were actually turning into oaks almost overnight. Now, why was Anglicization of women such a major issue here? Well, for the late 19th century intellectuals like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, Bengali Hindu women in their avatar of Deshmata, Deshomatrika, had come to represent the essence of indigeneity. Hence, the very prospect of our Panchi turning into the alien figure of a Mem Sahib evoked the fear of altogether losing the essence of indigeneity and becoming transmuted through the absorption of Western influences into something totally different from what is one's innate nature. An indigenous shal tree grotesquely turned into a foreign oak. Yet, as we have already seen, this very source of anxiety was also the object of desire to transform oneself into a mighty oak so as to be counted among the elites of the colonial society. Now, such conflict between desire and anxiety also plays out and in a way reaches its climax in the writings of Rabindranath Tagore. For instance, in Rabindranath's writings of the 1890s, we still hear the same argument about learning from the colonizer to improve the national character, which we encountered in Bonkim. Thus, here is an argument that we find in an 1891 essay by Tagore titled Prachu o Pratichu. Again, this is my translation. So, what will come of the English education? We will not turn into English, but we will become strong, uplifted, and alive. By comparing ourselves with others, we will be able to rid ourselves of any callow rusticity or undue excess regarding anything as ridiculous or corrupting. Now, note here the assertion, we will not turn into English, which betrays again the anxiety of deracination that any desire to learn from the English gave rise to within the colonial context. However, by the turn of the century, we see a change in the mood in Rabindranath Tagore's writings. In a cluster of essays that he wrote between 1901 and 1902, we find the sense of denigration that Tagore felt as a middle-class Bengali within the colonial system clearly outweighing any possible benefit that an English education might accrue. Here is an excerpt from one of these pieces. Our English preceptors reduce us to baseness through their bestowal of knowledge. They give with contempt and disrespect and keep reminding us, you have nothing comparable to what you are getting, and it is beyond your ability to repay what you receive. Daily, the poison of this humiliation enters our marrow and brings palsy, thereby making us dispirited. A year later, in 1903, in an address that he gave on the occasion of the Bengali New Year, we find Rabindranath no longer associating the progress of national life with the imitation of the colonizer by receiving his English education. Indeed, we find him making the exact opposite argument. So this is from his essay titled Noboborsho. That which we are refusing to look at out of disregard, that which we are not being able to know, that whose very hint detected from the windows of the English schools is making us turn our blushing faces, that is the eternal India. Now, what Rabindranath, as a representative of the English educated Bengali middle class, is asserting to his readers, who belong to the same milieu, by the way, is that any idea of progress in the national life needs to be predicated on the ability of the middle class to go beyond their English schools and, by implication, go beyond all the contact zones where they interact with their colonial masters. Now, these anxieties about losing one's true identity through Anglicization and the denigration faced within the colonial system was powerfully coupled for the Bengali middle class by the anxiety about their skin color. So by the 19th century, whiteness had become a key element in the British perception of their self-identity. Similarly, from the 19th century onwards, white skin acted as one of the main markers through which Indians identified the colonizing race and distinguished them as foreigners. So whiteness, in fact, has a history of its own. If you're interested, Radhika Mohan Ram's book titled Imperial Whiteness is a very good starting point. Now, therefore, with the white body playing such a crucial role in defining the English identity, both for the colonizer and the colonized, it was imperative that an attempt to become English also involve an attempt to become white-skinned. Yet Bengali efforts at Anglicization came up against an insurmountable barrier here. Thus, even the ardent Anglophile Michael Madhusudan Dotto was deeply shaken when, on his arrival in England, he was treated as a quote-unquote damned nigger. And even Bonkim, for all his fascination with the idea of learning from the English, was convinced that anyone with a dark skin had little hope of fair treatment in any employment under the colonial system. And in fact, his own career progression was stunted because of the fact that he was an Indian, he was a Bengali, and did not belong to the colonial elite. So, by the beginning of the 20th century, all these anxieties surrounding the desire for Anglicization within the colonial context came to a head for the Bengali middle class. And therefore, from this period onwards, we see a changing attitude towards Anglicization. This brings us to the third and concluding section of our lecture today. One of the trajectories that emerged from within the Bengali middle class society of this period was an absolute rejection of the desire to become like the English. And this resulted in a turn towards an anti-colonial nationalism, a radical anti-colonial nationalism. And this movement is perhaps best exemplified within the context of colonial Bengal by Rabindranath himself. Now, I have already shown how Rabindranath's reluctance to learn from the colonizer was articulated in some of his early essays, written during the early 20th century. But in actuality, his disillusionment with Anglicization can be traced back to the last years of the previous century, 19th century, and to his social essays like Kot Ba Chapkan, written in 1898, where he argues, and these are very strong words, "We will die but tolerate no insult. That is a sentiment too. Those who completely leave us out of their ceremonies, festivities, social formalities will not be invited by us in our puja festivals, sons' weddings, or father's funeral. That is a sentiment too. Their foreign attire is the national pride of the English, and therefore we will not insult our nation by being disgraced in it. That is also a sentiment. These are the very sentiments that are the real strength, the real pride of a nation." Now, such sentiments crystallized into a more full-blown anti-colonialism by the beginning of the 20th century, which saw the outbreak of the Swadeshi movement. Now, as you'll know, that Swadeshi movement is important in our history, not as the first anti-colonial movement, because there were a number of anti-colonial mass movements even before Swadeshi movement. The reason why Swadeshi movement is important is because it was the first middle-class-led anti-colonial mass movement in India. So the middle class first starts majorly participating in an anti-colonial discourse. Now, as you will also know, Rabindranath was one of the tallest leaders of the Swadeshi movement. However, by 1907, Rabindranath was thoroughly disillusioned with this movement, and he started disengaging himself from Swadeshi, and subsequently went on to become one of the most ardent critics of the brand of anti-colonial nationalism that the Swadeshi movement foregrounded. We know, I mean, from Gora onwards, his speeches on nationalism delivered in 1916, published in 1916, in fact, and also his novel Ghore Baire. So here we encounter, now Rabindranath did not return to his advocacy of Anglicization after this, but neither did he remain a votary of anti-colonialism in any overt way after that Swadeshi phase. So what we encounter here is called an aporia, or an impasse, where there is no clear resolution visible. Now, if we were to widen our focus a bit and shift from colonial Bengal to colonial India as a whole, we will see that the kind of critique of Anglicization and anti-colonial nationalism that Tagore preached in his years immediately leading up to the Swadeshi movement was taken up and later amplified by someone like Gandhi. But since our context today is limited to colonial Bengal, we will not go there. What I would like to conclude my presentation with is another trajectory that emerged from within the Bengali society during the 20th century and that ran parallel to the trajectory of nationalism. This other trajectory is best represented by the writings of Niroti Chaudhuri, who took it upon himself to reinterpret the 19th century Bengali middle class project of Anglicization. Now, though Niroti Chaudhuri acquired international fame in 1951 after the publication of his The Autobiography of an Unknown Indian, we need to remember that he was born more than half a century ago in 1897, actually. He therefore grew up in that very same Bengali middle class social milieu where the goods and the evils of Anglicization were still hot topics of intellectual debate. However, by the time Niroti Chaudhuri emerged as a public intellectual in the 1920s, when he edited and actively contributed to Calcutta-based journals like the Modern Review and Shonibarer Chithi, three very specific problems were already strongly associated with the desire for Anglicization. The first problem, of course, was the fear of losing one's true, innate indigenous identity. The second was not being accepted as an equal by the British colonizers, irrespective of one's level of Anglicization. And the third, of course, was the problem of the dark skin. Now, Niroti Chaudhuri's own Anglicized self-fashioning sought to address each of these three issues by foregrounding a unique argument about Aryan migration, out of all things. Now, in the late 18th century, the colonial administrator William Jones had pointed out the similarities between Sanskrit on one hand and Western languages, classical languages like Greek and Latin on the other. And in the 18th century, the Oxford-based German Orientalist Friedrich Maxmuller used this linguistic link, to propose a unique and, as we know today, a problematic racial theory. What was that? He argued that the presence in India of Sanskrit and languages derived from Sanskrit, including Bangla, means that a group of people migrated to India who shared their ancestry with people who settled in Europe and gave rise to the Greek and Latin-speaking civilizations and their modern incarnations. In short, this was a theory of Aryan migration, which stated that the Aryans, who were a race of fair complexion, then this is important, Aryans were perceived as a race of fair complexion people. They were a fair complexion people speaking a Proto-Indo-European language that was still not differentiated into Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. So this was kind of the mother language. And these Aryans, speaking these Proto-Indo-European language, migrated from their common homeland in two different directions. The group migrating to the north entered Europe, while the other group migrating to the south entered India through Iran. In India, they conquered the dark-skinned speakers of non-Indo-European languages. They made these people into their dasas or slaves, from whence apparently came the distinction between Aryavarna and Dasavarna of the Rigveda. So this is Max Muller. The term Varna was interpreted by Max Muller as color, which was regarded by him as the physical marker that differentiated the Aryans from the non-Aryans, as two segregated social groups with different languages and different religious practices. He extended the same theory to the contemporary period and argued that the English colonizers, and just look at the stretch of his imagination, he argued that the English colonizers were Aryans returning to India for a second time to be reunited with their Hindu brethren who had come as colonizers thousands of years ago, right? Now, Niroti Chaudhuri was heavily inspired by Max Muller and his theory of Aryan migration. Indeed, he was inspired by him from his very childhood when his father first introduced him to this German Orientalist. And as an adult, in fact, he would go on to write a full-length book on Max Muller, and he would use the theory of Aryan migration as a pivot to justify and defend his anglicized self-fashioning. Now, from today's perspective, it might appear that Chaudhuri was relying here on a rather dubious piece of academic scholarship. Indeed, Max Muller himself, at a later stage of his career, stopped advocating this theory. But we will also have to understand that in the Bengal in which Chaudhuri grew up, Max Muller and the theory of Aryan migration enjoyed tremendous popularity, especially among the Hindu population. And as Topon rightly points out, and I quote from him, Max Muller's scholarly theories concerning the common origin of all Indo-Aryan races based on his linguistic studies were received with incredible enthusiasm in India. The belief that the white masters were not very distant cousins of their brown Aryan subjects proved a much needed salve to the wounds of the dependent elite. A spate of Aryanism was unleashed. The word Aryan began to feature in likely as well as unlikely places, from titles of periodicals to the names of street corner shops. For Chaudhuri, the Aryan migration theory allowed him to address two of the three problems that plague the Bengali middle class desire for Anglicization. Firstly, the very idea that the modern day Indian Hindus were fundamentally the same as the British colonizers because of their shared ancestry removed the anxiety about losing one's true identity through Anglicization, innate identity through Anglicization. Why? Because if the fundamental identity is the same, then the Indian/Bengali Hindu cannot become deracinated by trying to emulate the colonizer, because they are ultimately the same because of the shared ancestry. This line of argument also solved for Niro Chaudhuri the problem of his dark skin color, because Niro Chaudhuri could now argue that whatever his present skin color was, it was fundamentally white, because he was ultimately the descendant of an Aryan. So whatever variation might have happened in the skin tone was because of the darkening effect that the tropical sun has had, which was ultimately superficial, nothing that a good dose of Fair and Lovely could not mend. Thus, as Niro Chaudhuri writes in his book, The Continent of Circe, by 1955, he had become convinced about his own fundamental Englishness, which meant that in his post-1955 writings, the project of anglicized self-fashioning gets recoded as the project of recovering his true English identity from beneath the layers of Indianness. Thus, the desire for Anglicization here gets restored by being turned completely upside down and inside out. Now, irrespective of Chaudhuri's claims of being fundamentally English and therefore the same as a colonizer, it did not automatically win him a place within the society of the colonizing elites. I mean, the British were not really that impressed. I mean, you could claim yourself to be an English based on some theory by some Orientalists, but that did not mean that you were readily accepted within the British society. And Chaudhuri therefore remained a lifelong critique of the colonizers who refused to accept him as a brother and an equal. And this critique, though all pervasive in Chaudhuri's work, often goes unnoticed by people who focus solely on his admiration for the colonial rule. However, this note of criticism can be heard most unmistakably in the collection of his essays, Why I Mourn for England, which was published just a year before his demise in 1999. Now, interestingly, Chaudhuri survived long enough to see the ideals of being English disappear not only from India following its decolonization, but also, very interestingly, from Britain itself following its late 20th century turn towards establishing a multicultural society. So in 1966, just a year after the publication of The Continent of Circe, where Chaudhuri so boldly claims to be really and truly an Englishman, the then British Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, spelled out the agenda for a multicultural Britain, where he said this, and I quote, "I do not think that we need in this country a melting pot which will turn everybody out into a common mold as one of a series of carbon copies of someone's misplaced vision of the stereotyped Englishman. I define integration, therefore, not as a flattening process, but as equal opportunity accompanied by cultural diversity in an atmosphere of mutual tolerance. This is the goal." Now, with this disappearance of the idea of a stereotypical hat-wielding white Christian Englishman, the entire phenomenon of cultural anglicization, which was pivoted on becoming such an English figure, became irrelevant. This turned an individual like Niro Chaudhuri and his entire life's goal to become an Englishman into a living relic that had little currency in the contemporary world. The trajectory of anglicization that Niro Chaudhuri represented thus also ends in an aporia, in an impasse. Therefore, as we look at the cultural history of the Bengali middle class, we find at its heart a self-fashioning project which neither reached a climax nor was it ever properly denounced. Anglicization of the Bengali middle class therefore remains even today an unfinished project whose disturbing presence haunts us like an unburied dead. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay, for such a wonderful lecture. I think the audience, they have really enjoyed this lecture. And now I will ask my colleague, Ms. Jyoti Ganguly, to pass the questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you, Troidi, and thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay. It was really wonderful listening to you. And we have one question from our respected HOD, sir, Dr. Shubhadeep Ray. He asks, he actually requests you, sir, if you would like to explore the class question a bit further for our postgraduate students. Sir says that the English educated middle class was also led by such figures like Vidyasagar, who was a self-made man. Yeah, and as sir also refers to Professor Sarkar's essays, so would you like to elaborate on that, sir?
Yes.
The class question.
Yes. When we talk about the Indian middle class, we first of all will have to understand that when we talk about such classes or such social groups, we talk about a core which represents the norm, and then there are some exceptional deviations. So if we look at the colonial middle class that emerged in Bengal, it had a very specific, at least the core had a very specific class and indeed caste characteristics. Now, class-wise, at least the Bengali middle class that emerged during the first half of the 19th century and also during the third quarter of the 19th century, I would say, were primarily people from fairly well-to-do families, right? And the reason for that was primarily because English education was expensive. Not only that, not only was English education expensive, it was also relevant to a small section of people. I mean, the relevance of English education, the relevance of the kind of education that someone like Michael Madhusudan Doctor received increased with time. But when someone like Michael Madhusudan Doctor or any of the other young Bengal leaders enrolled themselves in the Hindu college, now Presidency University, there was no utilitarian relevance of that education, right? So it was primarily a group of wealthy people coming mostly from upper caste Hindu society who represented the Indian, who represented the Bengali middle class. Now, having said that, and this is the core, having said that, we do have deviations like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. And by the way, when we are talking about Vidyasagar, we'll also have to remember his association with Samskrita College. And here, the spatial politics is very interesting. So, I mean, those of us who are aware of the layout of that college street would know that on one side we have Hindu College, which is the seat of Western education, and on the other hand we have Sanskrit College. Interestingly, Sanskrit College was established with the funds of East India Company, whereas Hindu College was established by the indigenous elite population, the moneyed population, right? Vidyasagar belonged to the other side of the street, right? So though we do perceive him as part of that middle class which emerged during the 19th century in Bengal, we will also, if we focus truly on the dynamics of how the middle class was unfolding, and there was also this debate between Anglicists and Orientalists, etc., etc. So if we delve deeper, we will see that Vidyasagar, in certain ways, represented an opposition to the anglicized middle class that was being bred in spaces like the Hindu College. So, and Vidyasagar throughout, and even his later politics, his later political self-fashioning, his association with the marginalized section, for instance, his exiling himself from urban Bengal later in his life, and going and living with the subalterns. That really represents a kind of a political stance which was very critical of the upper class, upper caste milieu that represented the anglicized section of Kolkata. So I would not really like to conflate a figure like Vidyasagar within the category of middle class. He was both part of the middle class and, in fact, one of the critical voices that critiqued the social and intellectual position of the middle class. So, yeah, that would be my answer. But I don't know. I mean, this was a complex question, and this was a problematic question in the sense that I could answer this question, I hope, but then trying to answer this question for the students would take me in a completely different direction. I don't know how to simplify these matters because there's so much historical complexity underlying all of this. So, yeah.
So there is another question from one of our former students. He says that, sir, do you see the association of the utilitarian education of 19th century showed by Dickens in Hard Times and the emergence of middle class in India? Moreover, when it is said that India missed the bus to industrialization. So do you see the association of the utilitarian education of 19th century as Dickens represented it in Hard Times and the emergence of the middle class in India?
Right. Dickens, Hard Times, and the Bengali middle class. Fine. When Dickens was writing, Dickens's Hard Times, and in fact many of his other books, was primarily a criticism of the kind of industrialization that had taken place in Britain during the entire period of 18th and 19th century, post-industrial revolution. So Hard Times is part of that critiquing of that social milieu, how industrialization dehumanizes the population who are plugged into the processes of industrialization. Not only the laborers, Hard Times talks more about the laborers, but if you look at his other novels like Dombey and Sons, it also talks about the dehumanization of the entrepreneurial class. The problem of trying to draw a straight line from this world of Dickens to the Bengali middle class of the 19th century is that the Bengali middle class or the Indian middle class at large, which emerged during the 19th century, was not associated with any large-scale industrial endeavor. In fact, they were not, as I mentioned, um, referring to Shamit Sarkar, that they were not associated with any entrepreneurial activity per se, trade, industrial production, etc., etc. And the reason for that was because under the colonial regime, India could never develop as an industrial powerhouse. Of course, that would not make sense to the colonizer, right? Because they were using India to procure cheap raw materials for their industrial centers situated in Britain. So why would they support the industrialization of India? So the middle class that emerged in India was not associated in any major way with industrial production. And also in terms of trade and commerce, apart from the Bombay Presidency and some families like the Tatas, etc., there was no link with trade, which was the mainstay of 19th century middle class in Britain, for instance. And that also makes sense because some people tried, for instance, Rabindranath's elder brother tried, but allowing them to flourish as traders, allowing Indians to flourish as traders, did not make much sense to the colonizing British because then, I mean, that would reduce their profit margins, right? So Indians mostly remained junior partners of British entrepreneurs, if at all they were engaged in trade. So yeah, I don't know how to map Dickens onto this 19th century Bengali middle class. I don't know whether that should be mapped at all because of this fundamental difference.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I don't think we have any other questions. But before ending, I think I would like to ask one question, if you permit me.
Sure.
That the last line with which you ended was the anglicization, the problematics of the anglicization of the middle class till today is unresolved, as you said, the problematics.
Yeah.
So how do we see that in the context of diaspora, transculturality? Because our students have read that to some extent. So if you could just,
Okay.
and globalization for that matter, also we have second, third generation diaspora. So
yeah, sure. When we talk about diaspora, we are usually talking about Indians settled in America. Usually, we are thinking in terms of Bharati Mukherjee and that kind of figure. But if we think of diaspora in terms of Salman Rushdie, for instance, who writes a lot about it. In fact, Salman Rushdie too is deeply, or at least till one point in time, till he wrote Satanic Verses, he was deeply involved in this politics of Anglicization. All right. If you read the Satanic Verses, I don't know whether we can read the Satanic Verses, is it permitted or not? But anyway, if you can get hold of that book and if you can read it, you will see that he still continues with this hangover of, the central figure, one of the central figures, Saladin Chamcha, still retains this hangover that he has to anglicize himself. And this hangover is actually a reflection of something that Salman Rushdie deeply felt growing up in Bombay. And he talks about this in his essay, Imaginary Homelands, where he, growing up in the Bombay of 1950s, 1960s, he still retains this desire, which comes from an earlier period, that he has to anglicize himself. He has to fit in within the society of the colonizer, within the dream England. And there are other figures. I don't know whether we read them as part of our diasporic literature or not, there are other figures like Dom Morris, for instance, who also went and stayed in England. For them, this issue of Anglicization still remained alive, and they kept referring to it in their writing. However, with the diasporic authors who migrated and settled in America, in Canada, and in such places, this hangover of Anglicization did not make much sense, because, as you'll have to remember, Anglicization had to do with the desire to fit in within the society of the British colonizers. Now, if you were not trying to fit in within that society, if you are trying to be part of the American society, which has a very different cultural politics altogether, then this entire concept of Anglicization does not really bother you. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Over to Troidi and sir.
Thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay, for the illuminating speech and thought-provoking speech, of course. Our next speaker is Professor Himadhi Lahiri, who needs no introduction because most of us are directly or indirectly students of HLSAP. Professor Himadhi Lahiri is a former professor, Department of English and Culture Studies, the University of Burdwan, West Bengal. Presently, he is a professor of English at the School of Humanities, Netaji Subhash Open University, Kolkata. He has written extensively on diaspora studies, post-colonial studies, and Indian English literature. He is co-editor of Revisiting Partition and Bangladesh Literature, Bangladesh Liberation War, Contemporary Perspectives 2020. His other recent publications include Diaspora Theory and Transnationalism 2019. Professor Lahiri is also an accomplished poet. So I request our dear HL sir to please deliver his lecture. Over to sir.
Are you there, sir? Sir, are you there?
I'm there. I'm there. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I think you can see me also right now.
Yes, sir, absolutely okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you and very good afternoon, everybody. You see that it was a pleasure for me to listen to the earlier lecture, which provided a very good background information of the 19th century and the spillover of that kind of insight into the present moment as well, 20th century and the present moment as well. Now, my focus today will be Indian English literature written in English. And you know that I have given tentatively the title, which you may have received, which is Postcolonialism, Postcolony, and Indian English novel, which is a big area. And since today's audience basically comprised the students, undergraduate and postgraduate students, I will be a bit not very focused, but also my intention will be to provide some kind of insight into the background, as well as familiarize some students, the students with some of the very important moments of history, Indian history of Indian English literature, which also means that I will talk about some texts which are very famous, very celebrated, and our students might be able to have some ideas about them. And we can also discuss at the end of my lecture. You know that when we say Indian English literature, we have a very problematic kind of a scenario, which is Indian English literature. How can we define Indian English literature? Because you know you have, you include within it Indian works translated from the Bhasha literatures as well. You also include literatures written by diasporic writers, transnational writers, which are being produced in a different country, in a different nation. And we also include that because the diasporic writers have their roots in India, they have Indian descents. So should we claim their writings as Indian English literature? So there are questions like this, whether the literary works translated from Bhasha literatures can also be included in the nomenclature, Indian English literature. There are questions like that, and most of the syllabi in different universities reflect these aspects, okay? I'm not going into that. I only wanted to sensitize the students to such kind of a problematic area that we call Indian English literature. As you know that I'm supposed to speak on the post-colonial literature, post-colonial Indian English literature, but I have also added a single word, which is, I think, very important, which is, the word is post-colony. Okay? It has some theoretical implications. I will come to that later on, and try to relate this concept with some of the texts, some of the moments of Indian English literature as well. In the post-colonial literature, you know what post-colonialism is, you know what the period, how we can characterize the period. I'm not going into that. But when we say post-colonial literature, post-colonial Indian English literature, you know that we refer to a corpus of literary works written by Indian English Indian writers after the Indian independence. Okay, you know that if you have a bird's eye view, you'll find that this literary landscape is characterized by certain very important features. I will isolate two of these features. Number one, how the Indian English literature actually witnessed experimentation in themes, in topics, and in language and style. This is number one. And number two, that which is also part of the set of part of this experimental scenario, but which I shall also focus to a certain extent, which is that Indian English literature, while representation of events like a partition of India or some other historical event or some other events of the past, you know, there are certain kind of approach to representation as well. And these approaches have, are indebted to what we may call social science area. These experimentations are indebted to social science theories. I will come to that later on, but I need to begin from the beginning, because you know, the students, I think, should know how Indian English literature began. I will talk on this particular aspect for about 10 minutes, and then I shall switch on to the post-colonial literature. You know that Vinay Dharwadkar, in a very interesting article, talked about 4 contact zones. Okay, from these contact zones, the Indians of the 19th century, or even before that, they learned how to speak English, how to write English. And these 4 contact zones are: number 1, the zone of employment, the zone of marriage and family, the zone of religious conversion, and the zone of friendship and social relations. You know that the zone of employment actually referred to the early use of English as a language of contact, as a language through which you can express your intention, your sentiment, everything. And this period saw the emergence of the Dobhashis. And these Dobhashis, who are interpreters actually, that go between kind of people who contacted the Sahibs, the Englishmen, basically for the purpose of transactions, business transactions. And this also produced a class of people who in some way or other contributed to the English literature in certain ways. I shall mention Din Muhammad, who had obviously written a wonderful book, Travels of Din Muhammad, which was published in 1794. And this is a product of this zone of contact, which Vinay Dharwadkar has characterized as the zone of employment. In the zone of marriage and family, you can include writers, poets like Derozio, Ruskin Bond, Alan Seeley, because they were the products of mixed marriages. Okay? And some of them were obviously called, they were called Anglo-Indians as well. So this is the second zone. In the third zone is the zone of religious conversions, and religious conversions during the 19th century specifically. They produced a good number of very important writers, creative writers, and among them you could include the members of the Dutt families, okay? Dotto family, Toru Dotto, Uru Dotto, you can include all of them in this category. And then there were also a group of people who were the products of the zone of friendship and social relations. Okay, so this was the early period, and this was a kind of beginning of the English, the use of the English language, and also the production of literary works in English. You know that very interestingly, the Din Muhammad is usually called the first work written in English, although it was not a fictional work. But the first fictional work is a very important work, but about which we do not know much, is called A Journey of 48 Hours of the year 1945, which was written in exactly 1835, the year when Macaulay's Minutes was published. Okay, this was written by Kailash Chandra Dutt, and this is a narrative of insurgency. Okay, the first fictional work is written about the insurrection of a group of people against the East India Company. Okay, so from that point of view, it is a very landmark production, although this book was lost for a long, long period. And in the early years of this century, it was found again and it was republished. Okay. The next work, which is also very important, and this also is a speculative fiction like Bidhan Chandra Dutt's fiction, which was called Republic of Orissa, Annals from the Pages of the 20th Century. So this again was a narrative of revolt against the British Raj. So you see that the first two works written in English actually is a kind of a proof of how English language can be used against the colonizers themselves. And therefore, these two works should be known by the students specifically, because in the beginning was the rebellion, and the narratives, these two narratives, also led to some other narratives. But then I feel that these two works are very, very important, and students should be aware of these two works. You know that the next work that became very famous, which is Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Rajmohan's Wife, which was published in 1864. It was a narrative of social reality, which concerned the social reality. But then these works, which came very late, but then these works, the initial works, contributed to the understanding of how literary works in the form of a particular genre can be used. Okay, so from that point of view, I think this is a very interesting beginning, and this beginning was carried out in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, in the 30s and 40s specifically, by the three important writers, Mulk Raj Anand, R.K. Narayan, and Raja Rao. And there were some other writers in between, but I'm not speaking about them because they were not that much famous. Okay, so this, in a way, in a very nutshell, the beginning, and this beginning is a very important historical moment about which all of us should be aware. Now, you know that coming to the post-colonial period, which we officially, historically mark, the 1947 is marked for this purpose. And this was a phenomenal period because it began in 1948, the very important product, which is called All About H. Hatter by Desani, as you know. This work was a very important work in the sense that it introduced certain representative techniques which were followed in the 1980s by Rushdie and others. I will come to that. But 1948, for that reason, it can be earmarked as the beginning, but in between 1948 and 1980s, there was a gap in which this particular narrative style and topic, the themes were not followed, and therefore 1948 should be connected with the 1980s and the works that came later. You know that the title of my presentation today is Postcolonialism, Postcolony, and Indian English Novel. You know what postcolonialism is, but I shall specifically focus on the aspects, two aspects specifically. Number one, the dismantling of the hierarchy, the dismantling of the privileged classes who are privileged, always privileged because of their power, because of their education. And next, I shall also talk about the ethical aspects of post-colonialism, because you know the foundational moments of post-colonialism as a movement, as activism, was marked by the dismantling of the inequality, and which also searched for justice, as you know. So ethics was a very important aspect of the post-colonial moment. Now, this ethics was flouted again and again in the Indian political scenario, and political and social scenario, because we didn't achieve many things in the post-colonial period, because the kind of the image that we conjured about the post-colonial time has never been achieved. So from that point of view, we see that it was a certain, in a certain way, the post-colonial period is a continuation of the strategies of the colonial period. Only the rulers have changed. And therefore, you see, this aspect is not usually discussed, but there is a wonderful book by Akil Emembe. The pronunciation of the author's name is a bit difficult, and I'm not sure whether I pronounced it right, but the spelling is M-B-E-M-B-E, Akil Emembe. So this author, actually, she is a post-colonial critic. He wrote a wonderful book which is called On the Post-Colony. And the concept of the post-colony is fleshed out there. I shall, for 5 or 10 minutes, I will talk about the post-colony, because the concept of the post-colony, I think, should be, can be used in the praxis, in the interpretation of the texts, in the interpretation of the post-colonial situation, whether you mean it from, whether you refer to it from social point of view, or from the political point of view, or from the literary representational point of view, the concept of the post-colony should be kept in mind. This is my opinion, because this will give you a different kind of trajectory to talk about the post-colonial literature or the post-colonial performances. And post-colony, as you know, is the space which is marked by the independence from the colonial moments, okay, the colonial legacy. And it should be marked by, as you know, a certain kind of ethical considerations, certain kind of the establishment of ethics, certain kind of ethics which was supposed to have existed before the colonial period. In the pre-colonial period, we conjured the pre-colonial period as a wonderful period when there was nothing like the subjugation, although it was not true, but then this is a kind of popular imagination of the pre-colonial period. Now, the interpreters, the theoreticians, when they wrote during the colonial period, they conjured up a beautiful decolonized picture of the post-colonial period. Now, that image, that dream was not fulfilled, and that is why Akil Membe's concept of post-colony should be read. I think that should be taken into consideration, and they can be applied to our analysis of different texts. Now, you know that post-colonialism was being actually critiqued right from the 1980s, okay? And some of the critics who actually went against the grain of post-colonialism as it was being practiced, one very important post-colonial critic was Simon Gikandi. Now, Simon Gikandi told that that from the I'm quoting him, from the late 19th century to 1960s, decolonization in most of the third world had been defined as the restoration of the nation to its imagined pre-colonial autonomy and the securing of its identity from exogamous forces. So you see that the basic concept was to return to the pre-colonial period and to be free from the exogamous forces, by which he meant the colonial forces, the colonial subjugation. Now, the national culture came into the focus, the nation came into the focus, and this is reflected in many of the representations of the post-colonial period. Indian English literature is a witness to that. Whether you think of, you see, the Midnight Children, or whether you think of the great Indian novel, or many other novels, you'll find most of them were talking about the post-colonial nation. So the nation became the target of representation, the basic raw materials of representation, literary representation. And from that point of view, you see the novels were wonderful novels in experimentations of the post-colonial reality. Now, coming back to Gikandi, who talked about also the against the Eurocentric ideas, and the Eurocentric ideas and cannot be accepted. And from that point of view, the Indian authors attempted to create a picture of the specific reality, social and political reality of the Indian nation. And therefore, you see, the concept of universalization was to a certain extent avoided, and the attempt was more to the representation of the specific reality of the nation state. Now, therefore, you see that the dream of the post-colonial nation was obviously dying, and Gikandi has pointed out that while talking about the representation of the post-colonial writers, he says that nobody by the 1980s and the 1990s was convinced about the dream of the writers who wrote during the colonial period. But then what is very important for me in this lecture is that the concept of post-colony was actually advanced by Akhil Membe. As I said, it figures out the condition is the post-colonies. Appropriately, the notion of post-colony, as Membe actually observes, and I quote him, identifies specifically a given historical trajectory, that of the societies recently emerging from the experience of colonization and the violence which the colonial relations par excellence involves. He says that the post-colony is characterized by a distinctive style of political mobilization, and this political mobilization is actually carried out by the new political regime, and the strategies and the ideals remain almost those of the colonial masters. So there was not much change. But the post-colony is also made up of a series of corporate institutions and a political machinery. So there was an alliance between the politicians who formed the government, either at the center or in different states, and also the political and also the economic classes, the businessmen and multinational companies. So there was an unholy alliances between the political class and the economic class, the business class. And this in a new form, constitutes a regime of violence. So there was a regime of violence during the colonial period, and it has been replaced by a different kind of regime of violence. So you see, there is no qualitative change. There might be quantitative changes, but there is no qualitative changes in the post-colonial period. And the problem of subjection and its corollary, discipline, you can think of Foucault in this sense. So you see that these were very much apparent there, and the state power, he says, through its administrative and bureaucratic practices, created a world of meanings all its own, a master code, which in the process of becoming the society's primary central code, attempts to institutionalize its world of meanings as a socio-historical world. So the new regimes in the post-colony, they wanted to introduce a new kind of reality where they said they actually devised certain kind of codes, and according to their practices, according to their utterances, according to their policies, this system must be adhered to. So there is no avoidance. You cannot, as a citizen, you cannot avoid this kind of you see the kind of manifesto that the state actually advances. And this manifesto is actually institutionalized. And this passes for the historical reality, the social reality. If someone says the Indian society is pure, there cannot be any pollution here, caste pollution, religious pollution, or any other pollution for that matter, that has to be accepted as the code of conduct, as the ultimate kind of directions. So you must follow that. This was institutionalized. So this was a very important point in members' ideas of the post-colonial. You know that the signs, the vocabulary, and the narratives that the system produces are not meant merely to be symbols. They are officially invested with a surplus meaning, which are not negotiable, and which one is officially forbidden to depart from or challenge, so as to ensure that no such challenge takes place. The champions of state power invent entire constellation of ideas. They adopt a distinctive set of cultural repertories and powerfully evocative concepts, but they also have resort, if necessary, to the systemic application of pain. As you know, this is what he calls the banality of powers in the post-colony. And this banality of power is accompanied by grotesque and the obscene, by the grotesque and the obscene, by the excess, okay? Which you can see not only in the countries of the South, but also in the US, which you have seen, which you are witnessing right at the moment, how the constitutional provisions are being violated. So the nation state, I'm not referring to USA right now, the nation state, you see, is a witness to a different kind of a post-colonial situation where the power axis remains, and the power is not only the power of the political power, but which is also business power, commercial power, and this commercial power, the business power, is also multinational power. So the exploitation continues not only through the state machinery, but also through the commercial, multinational, through the companies, multinational companies. So this is a kind of theorization about the post-colony that Akhil Membe speaks of. And I think this is a very important kind of a theory that we can accept and we can analyze, and we can also apply for the interpretation of the Indian English literature. As we know that I referred to Deshani's All About a Chatter, which was written and which was published in 1948. Now, what is so special about this book? This anticipates many of the literary style and literary themes which we'll talk about later today. First of all, you see that the author speaks in a language which is not pure. So linguistically, there are obviously many kinds of experimentations, and he very overtly says, very clearly says, this book is written in a language which is impure. So in a sense, it is a modernist experimentation, but by hindsight, we can say that it is also a kind of postmodernist experimentation, where he is not only talking about an Indian subject, but also a hybrid subject, a person who is born in Malay, who is 50-50, whose parentage is 50-50, which means that he was his mother was a Malay-born indigenous lady, and his father was an English father. So he was, in a sense, an Anglo-Indian from that point of view. So Desani, in the beginning, actually introduces a hybrid character, and he introduces a language which is hybrid. And this hybridity is taken over again in the 1980s by later writers and by the diasporic writers like Jhumpa Lahiri or Bharati Mukherjee or Salman Rushdie. Salman Rushdie mainly, he is an author who has spoken of hybridity and mongrelization. And Bharati Mukherjee also talks about mongrelization, which is a kind of hybridity, which is privileged, which is given an important position in the representational field, in the literary representational field. So it was Desani who introduced this trend in the beginning of the post-colonial period. And the protagonist is, as I said, is not only a hybrid person, but also a stateless person. And this suggests that no particular state, whether it is Malay, or it is India, or it is England, where he spent most of the time, or it is Africa, no nation can claim him as its own. So in a sense, he was the world citizen. He was a vagabond. So he speaks of, he actually talks about transnationalism and hybridization in a big way, which was taken up by the later authors. Now, in the book itself, the introduction is called mutual introduction. What does it mean? It suggests that it is not an introduction by one person. It is not an introduction by the author G.V. Deshani. It is also an introduction which is in which the protagonist H. Hatter takes an important part. So introduction is the result of both the author and the character. It was a very interesting experimentation which actually dismantles the authority of the author, which also gives a place to the main character, the protagonist. And this novel is a metafiction. It is very much self-conscious about itself. The writing is self-conscious. The author is always self-conscious of himself, but he does not privilege himself. He also takes into consideration the character which it creates, and the character which it creates is an interesting character who is called H. Hatter, Hindustan Wala Hatter. And in the word Hatter, you see, with a peculiar spelling, you find the word hat. Mad as a hatter, you have a phrase like that. So it anticipates madness in certain ways. And what kind of madness is it? It is a madness in the narration. The narration never goes in a straightforward way. And therefore, you see, the narration also speaks of the truth and the untruth, the truth and the lies. He says the lies are important constituent of my presentation and representation. This lie is in fact a kind of a lie which may not be lie at all. It is the license of the authors work through imagination, and what the imagination can achieve is not, you see, truth in a way. It may be a lie, but it is a lie that approaches truth in a very effective way. So from that point of view, this novel actually throws into wind all kind of concepts about truth and untruth, truth and lies are truth, and truths are lies. So there is an upside down kind of a situation here, which I think we should take care of. I give so much time to this particular novel simply because I think it augurs a new tradition of writing in the 1980s and later. And for that purpose, I think I should give some, I should have given some time to this particular book. Now, you see that Salman Rushdie is a professed follower of G.V. Desani. Okay, he said that I was very much influenced by this particular book. Now, if you look at his own experimentation, Rushdie's own experimentation, you will find many of these trends had been taken has been applied to his books, his novels, his fictions, which also talk about lies and truths, and you do not know which one is truth and which one is not truth. His novels are called, you see, as a kind of magical realism representation, where magical realism works, Latin American tradition of this particular genre actually works, operates. So you see, the truth, the reality is mixed up with myth. The reality is mixed up with all kinds of fables, all kinds of imaginary things, all kinds of lies, as you know. So when he speaks of the midnight children, the children who were born during the period from 12 o'clock to 1 a.m. at night, you know, they were the midnight children. And the children who were the nearest 12 o'clock had more power than the others. So the moment was important, and the moment, as you know, was 1947, 15th August. And therefore, this moment of Indian independence is intricately connected with the children born during the period. And this is a creation of imagination, absurd kind of a creation. And Salem Sinai, who is the protagonist, who had excellent powers of seeing the future and the past, and who had telepathic kind of relationship power, he assembled all the children of the period, and he actually met them in a conference. He organized a conference, and this kind of a creation of a plot, you know, cannot be done unless you are very much convinced about an alternative kind of plot setting, an alternative kind of narrative style, representational style. So why is it that Salman Rushdie takes up this kind of a narrative strategy, this kind of a narrative technique? Simply because the truth cannot be conveyed through the usual commonsensical narrative style, through which you can drive home a certain point, but that point may not lodge in your head for a long, long time. So it can only through a series of shocks that you can drive home the point permanently into somebody's head, okay, and somebody's mind. So this adoption of a style is very important from that point of view. And you know, the post-colonial Indian English novel actually is marked by this kind of a technique, which is introduced in a new way, in a fresh way, by, or rather reinforced in a fresh way by Salman Rushdie. Now, Salman Rushdie, as you know, also speaks of the a time of the, he's very much critical of the emergency period, 1975, where many kinds of state repressions actually took place. Now, these state repressions come under his purview, and this is the kind of post-colony that he focuses also in his representation in The Midnight Children. And this kind of partial focus, the entire focus is on the post-colony, but the way post-colony was seen by Akhil Membe comes during the pages, when you read the pages related to 1975, the emergency period, and the subjugation and the torture that went during the period, you can really find that Akhil Membe's concept of the post-colony is very much applicable here. Now, you can draw a parallel line. You can draw this, you can connect this also with the text that you read during in your postgraduate syllabus, which is The Hungry Tide. In Hungry Tide, you will find that there is an episode which is, as you know, the episode actually relates to Mori Jhapi incident, where the refugees from the Dandakaranya were killed, were fired upon because by the state itself. So the role of the state is very important here. And the novel, a part of the novel, a big portion of The Hungry Tide is also about the space called the Sundarbans, where this carnage actually happened. And this carnage was perpetrated by the state power. You know, the communist regime of the time, before the election, they went to some of the leaders went to the Dandakaranya and promised the refugees there, which lodged there, they were settled, almost settled there, that if we come to power in West Bengal, we will obviously settle the question of the refugee problem about your settlement in West Bengal. And so when they came to power, the communist regime came to power, these refugees made their way to West Bengal. They settled in many places, but mainly in the Mori Jhapi area, the Sundarban areas. And since it was a reserved area, it was reserved by the forest rules, and therefore nobody can stay here. So on that kind of a pretext, these people were killed like anything. And that is a colonial moment in the post-colonial history, like the emergency that we have seen earlier. So during the post-colonial period, you find the different kinds of the situations that happen, the subjugations that happen in a post-colonial, in the way Akhil Membe actually speaks about, we have enough representation of that in the post-colonial Indian English literature. You will find that kind of situation in many other representations. For example, you know, in the Great Indian Nation, which follows the certain kind of magical realism technique, a postmodernist kind of technique, a metafictional kind of a technique, and which also talks about the 1975 emergency, about which Sashi Tharoor is very much critical, and which was published in 1989. There also you will find criticism of the post-colony in a big way, and which is also carried out by other writers, and in their books, Arundhati Rai, for example, in their books like The God of Small Things, which was published in 1997, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which came very recently. You see, these were taken into, these were represented, the power of the state, the power of the people who are part of the power regime, and which perpetrate oppression of the marginalized sections of the people, population, and thereby flouting the ethics of the post-colonial movement. You know, so these are very much apparent in Arundhati Roy's fiction as well. You can also find this in, you know, Arundhati Rai talks about in the second book, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which was published in 2017. He also speaks of not only of dispossession of the poor farmers, but also of the Godhra train burning and Kashmir insurgency. So all these things actually talk about the kind of relations, the kind of things, the kind of the colonial power, the post-colonial power. The power is supposed to be post-colonial power, but they appear in the garb of post-colonialism. But then the power is basically, it partakes of the colonialism. The colonial operation is very much there. There is no change from that point of view. Now, you get a host of other texts also, for example, Adiga's text, The White Tiger, and you will find many other representation novels where you can find this trend. But the novels are representations of the social reality, the political reality. Only yesterday, you know, in the Facebook, I came across a post, as you know, which was actually given by one of my friends, which speaks of, and I quote the post, "I have no doubt that my country will be one day free, but I am afraid that brown shapes are going to sit in the chairs, the white shapes will vacate." This is a quotation from Bhagat Singh. In one of his letters, he wrote this. So what did he wrote? He expressed his apprehension about the post-colonial rulers. He says the colonial rulers will go, I'm very much confident about that, but what about the post-colonial rulers, the new ruling regime? So long ago, Bhagat Singh said that, and the post that I'm mentioning right now, referring to right now, that post actually talks about the last 2 days events of the farmers' protest who moved towards Delhi. And I just want you to connect to these events because the representations are not absolute lies, as you know. They have their reality in the actual world. And so the lies are not really lies. They are part of the reality. From that point of view, you know, these novels, these representations actually speak of, evoke not only post-colonialism in its excess, but also the dangerous form of the post-colony, which continues even today. So from that point of view, you see that the range of the representations I referred to, G.V. Desani, Salman Rushdie, Shashi Tharoor, Ray, Arundhati Ray, Adiga, you can link all these writers. And all these writers, in a way, through falsehood, which is not falsehood, which is representation, imaginary representation, through such kind of, within quotes, falsehood, they are talking about the reality. And this is what I want to mean by the post-colony that I have inserted in my title. So it is not about the post-colonialism that we understand in the normal sense of the term, in its ethical sense, but also in the violation of the ethical aspect of the post-colony that I wanted to emphasize on. So this is a point that I wanted to make. But you see that I also wanted to talk about another aspect of post-colonial Indian English novels, and which is also part of the experimental genre. And in this genre, the person whom I shall focus on is Amitabh Ghosh. Amitabh Ghosh has novels like The Shadow Lines, or The Hungry Tide, or The Sea of Poppies. You see, these novels actually, constitute a different kind of a genre introduced by Amitabh Ghosh. In this particular genre, he focuses on a kind of investigative writing, creative writing, writing about the past which is forgotten, writing about the past which is shrouded in mystery. And in order to bring that kind of a past into focus, you will have to resort to not only the usual kind of representational tactics, but also you should use your imagination. So imagination, along with the historical investigation, the investigation that the historians actually carry out, or the social scientists carry out, the political scientists, or the archaeologists, okay, or the ethnographers, they carry out. This is put into practice in the writing of the novels by Amitabh Ghosh. And this practice is sometimes called fiction, fact plus fiction, a portmanteau word. This is a term used by I've forgotten the author's name. I will tell you later. Brij Viblal coined the term fact plus fiction, a portmanteau word, simply because the facts are negligible. And therefore, you will have to resort to imagination. And therefore, what you write is a mixture of fact and fiction. So, Brij Viblal has written a book about the endangered diasporic population. in Fiji, which the title is The Other Side of the Midnight. Very close kind of relationship from the point of view of the title of the book, okay? In which he speaks about the indentured laborers who migrated to different countries like Fiji, Caribbean islands, and different other places. Now, you see, since the archives were not sufficient, so you resort to your imagination. The gaps must be filled by the imagination. So that kind of historical events can be represented through the different kind of fiction altogether. Bridgefield book is not a fiction. It's a kind of historical writing where fiction comes, imagination comes in a big way. There are other writers also who has followed similar kind of a trajectory of representation. But you know that in the genre of proper fiction, Amitabh Ghosh has materialized this. Now, whether you think of the shadow lines, you will find that the main character, Trideep, believes in digging. Okay, he is an archaeologist, and archaeology basically depends on digging not only into sites, historical sites, but also digging into certain kind of the past, which is history. So in order to talk about the partition and similar other kinds of happenings in the history of Indian history, you will find that technique was followed. So Trideep was a relentless follower of that technique, which was taken over by the anonymous narrator of the novel, okay, the boy narrator. And through that kind of a narrator, through oral narratives, listening to the oral narratives of Thamma and others, he digs out the real happenings, things that happened during the partition. Now, in the Hungry Tide, you see that the same technique is followed. The kind of motion of the travelers is followed. The novel opens with a narration of a traveling, in which Kanai is traveling in a local train, and where Pia Leroy, who comes from abroad, she also is traveling by the same train, and they met and they had some kind of conversation. The traveling is part of the ethnography, archaeology, archaeological style, and while you travel, you note down what is happening, and you ultimately chronicle those notes, actually chronicle those events in the form of a writing. So Amitabh Ghosh is also doing that, and in the process, in the Hungry Tide, he is not only speaking of a neglected area in Indian English fiction, of these spaces like the Sundarbans, but also he is digging out an historical event of the Morichapi incident, which was not spoken of earlier. So from that point of view, it is the Hungry Tide as a novel is the result of a different kind of technique in which oral narrative, in which the local history is conjured, is evoked, and which comes into the forefront. So local history, in order to bring out the local history, you must take help of the oral narratives of the local people. So through those narratives, he not only conjures, not only evokes the unstable space that is Sundarbans, the lives of the unstable people who live in the Sundarbans, but also parts of the history that is very much there in the past of the place. But that history is never actually evoked. And that is why Amitabh Ghosh brings out that kind of history through a different kind of a style, which is also part of the experimentation in the genre, but which is a different kind of experimentation, which is very, very real, which is very, very objective. And this kind of objective is also brought out in all his novels. For example, The Sea of Poppies, where the indenture labor movement, which is not talked about, not much talked about in literature, not even in history, the subjugation of that history, the subjugation of that history by the mainstream history is also brought about by the that particular book, The Sea of Poppies. So you see, the entire, we cannot discuss the post-colonial kind of history of the novel, Indian English novel, in a short spell like this, but I wanted to isolate these two important strain of the experimentation in Indian English novel, and how amnesia is overcome by anamnesia, which means recalling of the memory, which is very important, which is a very important post-colonial tool, okay, of representation. So amnesia, which is imposed by the colonial rulers, the amnesia which is imposed by the post-colonial rulers in the post-colony, all these amnesia, details of the amnesia are recalled by the authors, the new authors, the post-colonial authors, who took help of anamnesia, which means bringing back to memory, okay, recalling to memory. And this recalling is a very important strain in the experimental genres of Indian English novel. I will not go to other literary works in this field. This is what I wanted to say today. And thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much. I think I have spoken for about an hour or so. I'm not very sure.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure listening to you after so many years, personally for me, after the university days. And I think everybody, all of our students are privileged to hear you today, very, very enriched and enlightened. And thank you for that exhaustive overview that you gave. So we have one question from our colleague Shujoy. He asks that, sir, could you please elaborate on the pros and cons between Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children and Shashi Tharoor's The Great Indian Novel in respect of the treatment of mixture of myth and realism, as you have pointed out? Was there any difference between the two?
Of course, one point that you can think immediately is that, you know, that Shashi Tharoor's novel is totally dependent on the myth, okay? Right from the beginning, a unified kind of a myth, okay? But in Rushdie's novel, you will find fragments of myth taken from here and there, and what he applies basically is the norms of the myth. Okay, so for the structuring device, while Shashi Tharoor actually depends on the Mahabharata, okay, which translates like the Great India, okay, so the Great Indian novels comes from this. So he actually receives his impetus not only from the Mahabharata in its title, but also in the treatment, and the treatment is based on overarching structure of the Mahabharata. Okay, so from that point of view, You see, this is the main focus of the novel, but in which he also refers to other kinds of references. But I think Rushdie is much more fragmented. He's much more fragmented, and he's much more innovative in his representation of the postcolonialism, in which innovations of not only a different kind of a language, because Rushdie's language is much simpler, okay, than Rushdie's language, which is chutneyfied, where you will find different kind of experimentations as well, and where hybridity rules in a big way, where magical realism is much stronger. So these are the points of the differences that you can find out at one go. I think if you dig into the two texts, you will find really other areas, very interesting kind of other areas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. There's another question from Tomal, one of our former students. He asks, so do you think post-colonial Indian literature has deliberately overlooked the genealogical evolution of folklores in their postmodernist reconstruction or remodification to make space for brown sahibs / bhadralok / urban middle class to dominate the Indian cultural space with borrowed Western ideology? He actually asks this question with a special reference to the dying cultures of Bhadu or Bhardeshwari or other folklores which are mentioned in Bardhaman Jelar Itihash by Akkuri Chattopadhyay and Ashish Nandi's Intimate Enemy.
A good question, but I think that you know that if you think about the writers of the post-colonial regime, or even before that, what happens basically is that you think of the class of the writers, okay, to which class do they belong? That is very important, okay? So obviously there is a kind of legacy from the colonial period. They are educated in English medium schools or in English education actually plays a big role there. But then one important thing is that they may not be very much well acquainted very much with the local histories and the local myths. And therefore what happens is that when they represent the history with the myth as a base, they go to more or less the popular myths, the national myths, okay? And that is why you will find the national myths so much in the representations, okay? Even the kind of mythical writings, the mythical fictions that you come across very recently in the last 10 years or 20 years, you will find that basically the popular myths are dealt with. And the local myths that you talk about, the local histories that you talk about has to be digged out. That has not been done in a big way so far. And I think that kind of ignorance or lack of confidence is very much there in the representation, and what the writers know in a big way, in a proper way, and which is also available. And they have another point in mind. The book that has to be written has the audience all over the world. And they therefore, you see, they also have certain kind of strategies in mind while they represent, okay? That might also come in the way of representing the local myths, the local lores in a big way. But I think Amitabh Ghosh is a kind of writer who can do it very well. And I hope there will be writers in future who will be doing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. I think our HOD, sir, Dr. Shubhadeep Ray, he wants to say something. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for your exposition of postcolonialism, postcolony, and Indian English novel. And I think it has been an excellent experience because there has been a continuation between the previous lecture and sir's lecture. Thank you, sir. Sir has exposed particularly what I found interesting and very relevant to our time, that is the crude realities of the neo-colonial rule that we are facing every day. Thank you, sir. Now I request the convener, Madam, Dr. Troy Sinha, to please deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Shubhodipda. First of all, I want to thank the speakers. Thank you, Dr. Sayan Chattopadhyay, and thank you, Professor Himadhi Lahiri, for being with us, and all of you, I mean, both of you have enriched us with the erudite lectures. So I'm thankful to you. And I'm also thankful to to our principal, sir, Dr. Falguni Mukhopadhyay, for his continuous support. And I would like to thank Dr. Gautam Mukherjee, convener NAC committee, Dr. Chandrachud Das, coordinator IQAC, Professor Srimanto Sarkar. And I offer my sincerest thanks to Dr. Amit Banerjee from the Department of Physics, who is my colleague. And without his involvement, this webinar would not have been possible. So Amit, thanks a lot to you. And last but not the least, okay, and that is my department. Thanks to you, for Shubhodipda, for always being there, okay? And thanks to the other colleagues, Dr. Sangjukta Banerjee, Dr. Arup Ratan Bosak, Ms. Jayati Ganguly, and Mr. Sujoy Kumar Acharya. I'm always thankful to you for you have given me continuous support. Okay, so I'm really thankful to you, and I think that in near future we will be meeting again with such webinars so that some new areas would be explored. And till then, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I request everybody to please leave one by one.